much for a lovely introduction. Thank you so much for having me here, and to the donors and to the university and all the students and community members. So I'm just gonna, I think, talk a little bit about the origins of this book, and then I'll read you a section from the beginning, and then we can have some questions. So I know a lot of you here are freshmen, and I'm wondering how many of you guys know who Jerry Springer is? Okay, a decent number of you. So Jerry Springer, for anybody who maybe isn't familiar, was this trash TV, well, he actually still is a trash TV host, but the sort of heyday of his trash TV career was in the 90s. He was known for just these really outrageous shows like, you know, I Married My Goat and these kinds of things. He was, you know, kind of just this really 90s figure known for being just completely outrageous and sort of a precursor to reality TV in some ways. So back in 2012, around the time my first novel came out, I heard a This American Life episode about the backstory of Jerry Springer. And I was shocked to learn that this crazy trash TV character guy had actually been a progressive politician and had been the mayor of Cincinnati back in the 70s, and had actually been a very beloved mayor and a very beloved councilman who people believed might have a real future in politics. And he was felled by a scandal in which he paid for a prostitute with a check, and was then, you know, kind of dragged. Not a great idea. But he kind of rebounded. Right. The freshman, yeah. But he sort of rebounded from this scandal, and he kind of came back into politics, and he was actually regarded as this very substantive figure. And so I, as a novelist, started thinking about that, and I thought, how fascinating a transformation for somebody to make, to go from being a, you know, substantive, serious politician that people thought had like Kennedy-esque charisma and was going to go on to be a figure in like national politics, and to then become this almost self-parodic figure of just outrageousness in 90s trash TV. And I thought, how does somebody go from A to B? And I've actually written a draft of a fourth novel, so having written 4 novels now, I always know I have a novel idea when I can't get a question out of my head, and I'm really puzzled by it. You know, I'm not thinking, oh, I know the answer to that, and I want to present it in novel form. I'm thinking, I really don't know the answer to that question. That's just a really vexing, mysterious quandary for me to think about in fiction. And when I start kind of ruminating on a question in that way, then I start to think, oh, I think that might be a novel. So that was the genesis of The Spectators, was the question of how does somebody transform so completely over the course of their life. And then I wrote this novel from the perspective of 2 different point of view characters. One is this publicist who works for the trash TV host. His name in the book is Matthew Miller, and then he shows the Maddie M show. And she has this evolution over the course of the book where she starts off really hating her boss, just like having a lot of contempt for this guy. And over the course of the book, she kind of comes to a more nuanced understanding of him. And the other character is named Semi, and he is the Matthew Miller character's lover in the 70s, who goes from really loving this man, really idealizing him, both personally and also politically, and moves towards, you know, becoming very disillusioned with him as time goes on. So my hope was you sort of have these 2 characters who have like inverse trajectories in their thinking about this person, and hopefully as the reader, you kind of wind up with a very multi-dimensional, kind of complicated, nuanced view of this guy by the end of the book. And so I'm going to read just a little bit from the first chapter of this book, The Spectators, and this is from the point of view of the publicist. Her name is Sel. It's 1993, which will explain some of the jokes, probably. And what you need to know so far, I think all you need to know is Sel's this publicist for the Maddie M show, the trash TV show. Early in the day, there's been a school shooting. And because it's 1993, this is big news, and it's a really like shocking event that's occurring. It's sort of something akin to the Columbine shooting, where it's actually really startled the nation and really dominating the news media. And so they canceled the Maddie M show taping for the day, and Sel, the publicist, has gone to the bar where she meets up with her roommate. I think that's all you need to know. Okay. Nikki is already at the bar, flanked by the usual cadre. They're Wall Street types mostly, wearing suits, giving off vibes that are by varying degrees restless, sexual, cocaine-y, or straightforwardly murderous. They canceled the taping, says Sel, emerging from Nikki's coconut-scented hug, because of that shooting. Oh, right, says Nikki. I was sort of afraid you'd been fired. Not yet, says Sel morosely. Sel hates her job. Nikki turns to the guys and says, guys, this is my roommate, Sel. Sel, this is Alec and Scott. Sel nods. Alec and Scott are the usual. They radiate confidence. They wear ties. They will be going back to work later. They are always going back to work later, these men. And maybe this is why they tend to strike Sel as so menacingly goal-oriented. Their flirtations have the urgency of sailors on shore leave, or animals with very short mating seasons. Sel may look sweet, says Nikki, but don't let that fool you. Sel can tell from how Nikki's talking that these men like her already. Men always like Nikki, her raspy voice, her tan skin, both of which seem fake but actually are not. Sel, Nikki announces, has a secret. Oh, says one of the men. Nikki nods, and Sel sees her eyelid flinch into the smallest fraction of a wink. Sel, Nikki declares, works for the bad guys. The men look at Sel with marginally renewed interest. One of them has far, far too much hair. Teen wolf hair, one might call it, if one were feeling uncharitable, which one isn't going to be anymore. There must be a lot of these men in the city, but Sel never sees them when she isn't out with Nikki. Sel half suspects that Nikki summons or possibly creates them, that they materialize out of the ether only to buy her drinks. Or maybe it's Sel's witnessing this process that creates them, a sort of Schrodinger's cat scenario, but with fratty financiers. The bad guys, huh? Says Teen Wolf. Sel nods, dangerously, she hopes. Nikki has recently concluded that Sel's problem with men is, broadly, her personality. After 6 months in New York City, Sel is willing to concede this might be true. Men tend not to notice her jokes, or if they do, find them startling, as though witnessing a pigeon using an ATM. She'd said this to one of them once, startling him further. These sorts of men seem to grow dumbly literal with women, hewing close to introductory language-type dialogues, veering wildly into non sequitur. After a few months of this, Sel began venturing a few non sequiturs of her own, prompting Nikki to stage the intervention and impose a whole new set of protocols. Which bad guys? Says the less lupine of the dudes. Nikki shakes her head. It's too shocking to say. Tell us, says Teen Wolf, a little rotely, Sel thinks. Sel has agreed to a trial period of following Nikki's advice that essentially boils down to talk less. And so, instead of answering, she gives them her signature mug apology shrug, raised right shoulder, head cocked to left, the cheek pulled into sardonic half smile. It needs a catchphrase, Elspeth had told her when she'd been brainstorming it at Smith, like, what are you gonna do, or something. Sel had tried bellowing this in an overwrought Italian accent. What are you gonna do? And it did seem to add something, though for obvious reasons, she isn't about to do any of that now. We'll never tell, says Nikki. You'll have to guess. You see, this badness is shocking, says Non-Wolf. So I guess you're probably not one of us. He means finance, Sel figures. Muteness isn't so bad if you regard it as a game or a sort of formal constraint. She thinks of her college creative writing seminars. Write a haiku, write a paragraph using one-syllable words, write a sonnet in iambic pentameter, or the drama exercises from her improv days. Be a walrus with a limp. Be a walrus with a limp and a dark secret. Structural parameters can open up artistic possibilities. Look at the villanelle or the Olympus fussy shenanigans, so why not romantic ones too? It is in this spirit that Sel has experimented with some creative interpretations of talk less over the weeks. Once she pretended to speak very limited English, and once that she was hard of hearing, and once that she was slightly mad. For the madness, she channeled her own undergraduate performance as Ophelia, which role she had played as a goggle-eyed, breathy-voiced schizophrenic, according to Smithsonian. Reprising the part in the bar, she tried to make her voice even breathier. Nikki had refused to talk to her for a while after that. Tonight, as promised, she is keeping it simple. No, she says. Pharmaceutical company, says Teen Wolf. Use Alec, maybe? Sel knows a person can't help having hair in abundance any more than they can help being bald. Still, there's something a little decadent, almost rapacious, about having quite as much hair as this. Getting closer, chirps Nikki. You work for Saddam Hussein? You work for Jesse Helms? Sel can't believe they're still asking. She is amazed by how reliably this routine inspires male curiosity. They must imagine she does something sexily ruthless, something sinful chic, capitalist naughty, something that pays her lots of money to click around on stilettos and be very good in bed. People always forget that professional low-grade wrongdoing can, like anything else, be boring. Professional assassin, says the non-wolf. Scott, she thinks. Mercenary for hire? Sel taps her nose, and Teen Wolf looks for a second like he might almost believe her. This thrills her childishly. He isn't sure she's kidding, and why should he be? She could, for all he knows, be anyone at all. Do you give up, says Nikki. We give up, says Teen Wolf. Even our depraved imaginations have limits, says the other one, and Sel looks at him in what she hopes doesn't scan as a double take. Sweet little Celeste here, says Nikki, lowering her voice in conspiracy, works for the Maddie M show. At this, Alec makes a sound that is a cross between an O and a ha. Sel shrugs like guilty as charged, aware that her performance is veering perilously close to full-blown mime. You guys, says Nikki, I mean the Maddie M show, come on. You can't tell me it's not crazy that she works there. It is crazy, says Alec. I am completely obsessed with this fact, says Nikki. She is. It seems to clash with some firm concept she had formed of Sel before they actually met, and she's never quite gotten over the surprise. It is true that in Sel's response to Nikki's ad for a roommate, she had introduced herself only as a Smith graduate, true, with good credit, more like no credit, who worked in public relations, technically also true, but there was more she might have said about that. And it was also true that when Nikki first met Sel at a coffee shop on the Lower East Side one rainy afternoon, Sel was wearing a bright yellow rain slicker and 2 long jeans that were soaking wet at the bottom and had probably appeared entirely incapable of ever surprising anyone. The first thing Nikki said to her was, you weren't kidding, that raincoat really is yellow. The second thing, after Sel mentioned where she worked, was, holy shit. Nikki slammed both hands into the table, her rings making a boisterous clattering. She leaned over with blazing eyes and said, tell me everything. But there's more, says Nikki now, and Sel can tell she's worried about losing the room. You'll never guess what she does there. Security guard, says Scott, booking agent. She's the publicist, exclaims Nikki, as though learning this herself for the very first time. She's exceptionally good at this whole act, dropping hints, throwing cues, drawing Sel out of her faux recalcitrance, and then reacting with faux shock, which men should really find confusing, but somehow never do. Sel feels that there must be some way to monetize this skill, but every time she tries to think of something, she just comes up with him. Tough gig, says Alec. Were you there when that guy got tire ironed on the set? It was the parking lot, says Sel, and no. That publicist had a breakdown, says Nikki, and Sel's her replacement. This is usually the part of the conversation where Sel says, hey, it's a living. And just because this has become something of a catchphrase doesn't mean it isn't true. It is a living. She makes more than anyone in her family ever has. She makes enough to pay her rent and loans. She makes enough to stand here in the most expensive city in the country, drinking an $8 cocktail, having this stupid conversation. Sel has the sense that someone's asked her something. Sorry, she says. I said, how do you sleep at night, says Alec. Pills, she says, and decided to start counting her words. The Maddie M show, says Scott. Wasn't there a guy who married his sheep? Go, says Sel coolly. Don't, says Nikki, shifting into her civilian register. The woman's only on her first drink. I'll have to buy her another then, says Alec, and Nikki nods her approval. To the extent that this whole thing is a shtick, Sel finds something generous in Nikki's willingness to always play the straight man. But then again, Nikki does tend to come away from these evenings with dates more often than Sel does, so perhaps it's really more of a symbiotic thing, something ecological, evolutionary, like the remora and the shark. Alec points to her martini glass. Gin? Sel nods. Olives? She holds up 3 fingers. Nikki says it's important to issue very specific drink orders to men you might sleep with, and Sel sees the logic of this, though also she's just really cheap and loves olives. When Alec returns, he clinks his glass against Sel's and says, to Maddie M. Long may he reign, says Scott. Cheers, says Sel, and Nikki winks at her. A carnival barker, maybe, is what she should have been. So I have to ask, says Alec, and Sel thinks she knows what's coming. He leans toward her, his breath is gingery. The fights, are they real? Sel squints at her olives. She never knows what to say to this, even on nights when she's saying anything at all. The fights are real, in as much as they occur. Chairs are really thrown, beefy security guards really do intervene. Cell is always surprised that men so large, for whom sweating seems imminent, smell as good as they do. Light citral cologne, mint from the winter greens they crush during commercials. Cell has never seen anyone get really hurt, but she doesn't imagine that they aren't getting a little hurt. Having a chair thrown at you can't feel great, even a cheap one from a short distance. The secret crush guy got really hurt, of course, but that was unambiguously real and also happened in the parking lot. They're staged, says Alec, I knew it. Cell shrugs and makes a so-so wave with her hand. Are the fights real is, at the end of the day, too simple a question. The fights are preordained but not rehearsed. They aren't explicitly encouraged, but everyone knows the drill. And though the guests do amp up their reactions, they aren't inventing them exactly. The whole thing is part play acting and part reenacting, both a pantomime of imagined feelings and a ritualized display of real ones, something between a gladiator fight and a bacchanal. Sorta, Cell says finally. Are the fights real? Is this conversation? When you get right down to it, it's all very hard to say. How are we doing on time? Is that more? Well, I guess it doesn't matter, says Alec, looking a little disappointed. Those people are probably going to brawl whether you put them on TV or not. Cell wobbles her head on a diagonal axis that communicates neither negative nor affirmative. She knows because she's practiced in the mirror. Maybe the fights are a formal constraint of the show, the way Cell's silence is a formal constraint of this evening. One could argue that Maddie M is best understood as a subversive commentary on the talk show format, that its rigid structure is, paradoxically, precisely what enables its daring anarchy, that its careful adherence to the aesthetic it's critiquing is at the very heart of its vital genius. One could argue that the whole project is actually a triumph of Keats' negative capability, a masterful encapsulation of that liminal space between incompatible uncertainties. Cell doesn't actually believe any of that, but she can see how someone could. To Alec, she says, yeah. She's forgotten if she was supposed to be agreeing with something, and if so, what. But then again, it doesn't really matter. The very act of speaking to this sort of man mutes her meaning, just as another person's deafness makes you dumb, and another person's blindness renders you invisible. Alec swallows the last of his drink in a soundless plug. So you still haven't told me where you're from. His tone suggests that he has asked. New Hampshire. It is extremely unfair that this should count as 2 words. Oh yeah, says Alec. My family has a house on Lake Winnipesaukee. Beautiful area. Does your family live near there? Cell shakes her head. Near Dartmouth? Berlin. Oh, Alec says and winces. I've been through there. Really economically depressed area. Cell feels a familiar flash of heat. She isn't sure what kind of face she's making. If you ask me, I mean. Though she didn't in any way, it's not really a matter of opinion. Cell feels her ire unfurling. She takes a sip of her martini and waits for anger to cool into resolve. She is accustomed to this process, this sort of internal annealing. Still, there is the question of how to respond. Asking Alec where he's from will mess up her word count. Alighting where and are won't make up for New Hampshire, and will also probably make her sound drunk. Cell feels her ongoing low-grade desire to flee, flaring into an electric sense of requirement, something like the prickling dawn of a panic attack, the first hazy aura of a seizure. Another drink, says Alec. Cell nods, ordering the panicked feeling down. All that evil requires is for good women to remain polite. She laughs, and Alec looks pleased with himself. Be right back, he tells her. Okay, says Cell. A syllable saved is a syllable earned. Should she be counting syllables? She would have to consult Nikki. Cell turns to find her, becoming aware she does so that, 1, she is in fact conclusively drunk, and 2, there's been a subtle shift in the bar's background noise. The sound of conversation has become both softer and denser, and she notices a weirdly orderly bunching of people near the bar. The group seems to pulse a bit, revealing a glimpse of Nikki's velvet hat. Cell picks her way toward her, mentally preparing to argue, should Nikki object to her abandonment of Alec, that a man who is into muteness is probably really into invisibility. The group, it seems, is gathered around the television. She can hear it but not see it. The broad-backed financiers are blocking her view, which means it must be small and not for watching sports. Cell hadn't known this bar even had a TV. Cell pokes Nikki in the back. What's going on? Shh. A financier reaches over to turn up the volume, knocking over a hillock of peanuts. The vine-tattooed bartender eyes him fretfully. In the stricken community of Glendale, Ohio, grief turns to terror tonight amidst reports that one of the 2 shooters responsible for today's massacre is still at large. Cell can tell from the anchor's voice that this is network news. This is a voice prepared to tell the nation anything: presidential assassination, space disaster, nuclear holocaust. She maneuvers in order to see the screen, CBS. Though the police have yet to release the juvenile suspect's identity, authorities have confirmed that the second assailant has died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound sustained during the incident. Awful, Sel hears herself saying again. The word's wrongness has expanded since she said it last. Yeah, says Alec, who is suddenly behind her, the 2 martinis pretzeled into one hand. Sel registers an automatic sense of envy at the male hand's capacity to hold so many things at once, an inequity so indisputable, so bloodless, that she has even managed to semi-successfully joke about it with other men at other bars on other days, then she feels a flood of self-disgust for even noticing it. Why is she thinking about these things right now? And why is she now thinking about them? They said it was a student, she says to Alec to apologize. That's what they said a minute ago, yeah. The screen is showing the same row of emergency vehicles from earlier, though either the shot is wider or there are many more of them now. Behind the fire trucks and ambulances is an ominous cluster of black SUVs, and behind those is a line of yellow school buses. They look expectant and incongruously cheerful, like pencils in a case. Sel tries to focus on the screen, but her gaze keeps slipping to Alec, his hand cradling its forgotten drinks, his face utterly absorbed in what he's watching. It is a perfectly fine face, after all, the face of a man you would be glad to see your friend marry, and Sel feels a sudden inexplicable tenderness for him. She's appalled at how she hated him only moments ago, and only for mistaking her for someone else, when in fact she invites such misunderstandings. She revels in them. She loves being free to thrill in the secret fact of her own mind. She likes to feel aggrieved by her mask while delighting in the hideous privacy behind it. I'm here, I'm right here, and you don't even know it. Sel knows this much about herself. Time has gotten staticky, and after a while, Sel realizes that the crowd around the TV has dispersed. She has entirely lost track of Nikki. Life, after all, goes on. She taps Alec on the shoulder. From his expression, she sees he's forgotten she was there, but she leans in anyway and gives him something between a hug and a shrug. What are you gonna do? A line she never used on stage, but uses all the time in life, usually as a way of suggesting she's forgotten something that she has in fact never known. She wonders if one of these days she's going to catch herself using it to apologize for her entire life. Sel's halfway home before she realizes that the shooting might be the kind of news big enough for people to tell each other where they were when they heard of it. She already knows that if anyone asks her, she will lie. Stop there. Time for a couple questions? Yeah, time for a few questions.
Well, I'm gonna start out with a strange comment.
Okay.
I didn't know you were going to talk about Jerry Springer. I have a weird story for you, and I want to share it because we have a little time. So, when I worked in Chicago, I worked down the street from where the Jerry Springer show was being filmed, and just so happened, in my class, it was an honors class on pop culture, one of the students there was an intern. So she got our class a ticket to go to Jerry Springer. And I'm telling you this because 2 things happened that were most remarkable. You're all excited, right? If you were in my class, you'd be excited. You're going to Jerry Springer show. How many people would be excited? Yeah. Okay. We were excited. We got the van, we piled everyone in, we're going to Jerry Springer, Dr. DeLeo's the coolest professor ever. We get up there, and it starts. And what started was the strangest thing. It's the audience, as you say, is a player in there. They're part of the show. But the audience is totally constructed in this way. They told the students, everything you do here is going to be filmed. If you pick your nose, we can put it on national television. Everyone's scared. If you talk out of turn, we're going to have to start the show over again, and you'll be responsible, and then we could put your image picking your nose on national television. So they were terrified. All the responses are scripted. And so everything from the loudness, the rowdy, get rowdy and all, there's a big sign that says, comes out. By the end of the show, and then they also sorted us by our rowdiness. Of course, I was totally in the back row. And then some of the students were put in the front, and they had the chairs thrown on them. The response by the students when they got done the show was they were the saddest group of students I'd ever seen in my life. They were totally demoralized. They had no fun. They were threatened. And you know, it was a strange lesson to learn. But Jerry Springer was like a stand-up comedian, too. So he came out in the beginning of it, he got everyone rowdy, and then turned us back. But I just love that space for thinking about culture and audience and reality TV. So I just share that with you. Sorry.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's I never met anyone who's been an audience member. I've known somebody who I guess did some like entertainment during the commercials, but she had to sign like a non-disclosure agreement, so she couldn't really talk much about it.
Well, as I was walking out, he said to me, don't believe what you see. I mean, that's what he said. It's kind of haunted me.
Yeah.
Because he's looking at me and I'm looking at him. I shouldn't have been in the audience. I'm the absolute opposite of the Jerry Springer show. They put me so far in the back. I mean, see back there in the corner, under the red, yeah, that's where I was. So I'm sure if you pan the camera, you'd never see me.
Yeah.
But it was so surreal.
Yeah.
It was just the strangest thing. And they were fighting, and there wasn't a goat, but they were fighting. And the sign, what's interesting, the sign would have gone up, laugh, yell, so everything you did as an audience could not be spontaneous. Yeah. How to share.
Yeah.
So Jerry Springer was a big part of like my growing up. Jerry Springer was on after school, so when I'd get home from 6th, 7th grade, 12, 13 years old, I would watch Jerry Springer. I'd also watch Jenny Jones and Ricky Lake. And I wanted to ask you, when was your first exposure to Jerry Springer, and also what was your first episode? Mine was the twin sisters sleeping with one another. Go.
Nice.
Classic. Well, actually, funnily enough, to be candid with you, I never actually really watched Jerry Springer, qua Jerry Springer. What I did watch as a youth was Talk Soup, which would do like clips of all the reality shows.
I watched it too.
And make fun of them though. So like I only perceived Jerry Springer through this lens that was already like mocking it. So I didn't know much about it. I really got very, but I of course was familiar with it and familiar with the content, and I really got interested in it when I heard this American Life episode, because, which I would encourage you all to find and listen to, whether you read the book or not, you should really listen to this podcast episode, because it's really actually there's a lot of pathos to this guy's story, and I think that is haunting, that idea of him looking at you and saying, don't believe what you see, because Jerry Springer, when he was a progressive politician, really saw himself as an advocate for the downtrodden, and an advocate for the marginalized. And I think that there's some, not to psychoanalyze too much from afar, but based on some statements he's stated some in a commencement address he gave, I think there's a part of him that kind of believes that maybe that's what he's still doing. Like I think there's a part of him that feels aligned with these characters that are sort of trotted out to be objects of derision. I think he kind of has more contempt for the audience than for the people. And then at the end when he says, take care of each other, or what is it that he says? Take care of yourselves and each other. There's some sort of like kind of humanistic comment at the end that he says. And anyway, I just thought that was, there's obviously so much that's so outrageous and funny and just narratively exciting about this world, but I think there's something deeply sad about it too. And for me in writing this book, the kind of tragedy is this character who had actually good intentions, who might have in a different context become like a really good man, who maybe went astray situationally and maybe is sort of self-deceiving in some ways. But yeah, I didn't ever directly watch Jerry Springer. I only ever watched it through the lens of it being mocked, which I think made me not know until I was much older that it has sort of a vein of self-parody to it, because I was only seeing people mocking it, but I think it's got self-mockery kind of baked in, which just made it more interesting than like Jenny Jones and Ricky Lake, which were kind of the same type of thing, but like turned down a notch in a way they weren't as self-aware and sort of like winky. So anyway, I didn't see the twins episode.
Way in the back,
yes,
where the cameras can't see you.
Yes. So I'll start off with a comment and then a question to kind of contextualize it. So there's this movie called Full Metal Jacket, which is about the Vietnam War. There's a guy named Private Joker. And so there's a part where he's standing in line, but you see that he has a peace symbol on his helmet. So when his commander comes by, he says, like, what is this, some kind of joke? He's like, well, what do you mean? Why do you, And of course, when he asks about the peace symbol directly, he says it's about the duality of man, right? And so in hearing you speak about how there's someone who's become disillusioned. And then just in talking about how Jerry Springer went from one step of his life to the next step, what do you think, like first, what do you think about, like what do you think caused Jerry Springer to do that? And then what was your inspiration or your reasons for showing like the two sides or like
Sure.
a duality?
Yeah, sure. So, of course I would be happy to just psychoanalyze Jerry Springer all day, but I'll just talk more about my character who's inspired by Jerry Springer. So in the book, and I think probably it's something similar, well, Jerry Springer, and he was this politician, and then the early career that he had in broadcasting was, he was a journalist. He was like a serious journalist. And the early iterations of his show were much more like the Phil Donahue show, which I'm sure nobody remembers, but that was a much more kind of serious, like issue-oriented show, not comparable to the Ricky Lake, really outrageous kind of cheer-throwing thing. It was much more like, an actually substantive, thoughtful thing. I think what happened is that it got pulled into an ever more outrageous direction, I think through the incentive structure of ratings. And I think it was essentially a commercial motor that pushed it ever farther into this outrageous. And then at some point it like looped around and became sort of a self-parody.
Yeah.
So what happens to the inner life of a person during that process? I don't know, but I think what's interesting about it, and this may or may not be the case for Jerry Springer, but for my character, is that he kind of convinces himself on some level that what he's doing is still is still of a piece with the work he used to do. And it's up to the reader to interpret, to what extent that's true. I think he's not fully convinced that that's true, but there's a part of him that is telling himself that. So it's kind of an exercise in rationalization. So that's sort of how the inner life trajectory of my character. And then in terms of the question about the two, point of view characters and how they kind of cross in the middle in terms of their assessment of this guy. Well, I think the Cell character kind of mirrors like my experience, I suppose, of not really knowing much about Jerry Springer, but having, sort of casual attitude towards him and not thinking he was like a very complicated person. And then learning his backstory and being like, whoa, like whatever else I may think about this guy, that's a really complex man. That's a really deep story. And also, there was this moment, I think it was in 2002, when he was considering running for the Senate. And it was considered, Jerry Springer was considering running for the Senate, and it was considered this great joke at the time, because at the time, that kind of thing was ludicrous, that someone like Jerry Springer could become, a national politician. But little did people know that actually it wasn't just kind of reality TV clown trying to suddenly step into the role of statesman. It was actually this person who had been
You're almost there. You're almost there.
It was actually somebody trying to return to that person that he had once been, and was unable to do so. And I thought, that's just like a classically tragic story. That's like a Greek tragedy right there. It's just rich and it's interesting. So Cell kind of mirrors that experience of being like, ooh, I don't really have much opinion of this guy, and then being like, oh, huh. And the other character, I just thought, how interesting would it have been if you'd known Jerry Springer as this incredibly charismatic, incredibly promising politician, and then you watched his career go where it went. Would that not have been a hell of a journey? So that's where I kind of came up with the idea of these points, someone, people knowing him in different contexts and then moving backwards and forwards through time and developing more of a 360 vision of him.
Cool, thank you.
What's your name?
Angela?
Angela, yeah.
I actually really liked your first novel.
Oh, thank you.
I was a huge fan of it. But I really like in your work that you had an almost relatable tone in there, that you can like read something and like you can see it almost in a world that like the characters you can see out in the world today and like things that they go through at certain parts of your story. What was I would say, like, what inspired you to come up with these characters?
Like for Cell, you mean?
Yeah, or for like the Cell and then the other, can't think of
The woman in
Yeah.
arena. Well, I mean, it's a big question. I think the arena character kind of came to me as a voice initially. I just thought that, and that's a first-person narrator for my first book. It's a young woman who's diagnosed with a terminal brain disorder, and then she runs away to Russia, as one would, to meet a chess champion. But I think I just really liked that sort of like curmudgeonly, like old before her years kind of voice, and I think that's sort of what led me into that book, and especially since it was my first novel, you're kind of just like looking for some little like a thread that you can kind of follow into your book, and so for me it was like the voice in that case was Sal. You know, this scene that I read and that I often read, it was one of the first scenes I wrote of Sal, and it was really establishing for character for me. I think one of the things I liked about, I was interested in Sal as a character who was very much a chameleon, somebody who kind of constantly reinvents herself, and how that's a really interesting quality in fiction, because it's like morally neutral, you know, it's like, that can be a great quality, or it can be a terrible quality, and she kind of has this like shape-shifting ability to kind of be different people in different contexts, and she's a very young person, she's like, I forget, she's like 24, 25, and she's, you know, in a moment where she's kind of trying to decide like what self she's going to like land on. And, you know, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that over the course of the book, for her, it's a bit of a coming of age story of her kind of figuring out who she actually wants to be. But I thought it was kind of interesting to imagine also this divide between the inner and the outer life, how you have this like really like elusive, like complicated, pretty funny, like internal voice, and then this person on the outside is just saying like, yeah, no, like literally, like what would they think? You know, what would you perceive of this person if you interacted with her? Like basically nothing, you know? And I thought that was kind of an interesting, like fun way to kind of get into knowing her. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Does Jerry Springer know that his life story inspired you?
I am sure he does not. Not heard from him.
Can we know?
Yeah, sure. If anyone have his contact info or.
Yeah, no. Easy to find. Wow. Anyone else? Ken, did you have a question?
Well, I was just gonna say, if the young folks are not familiar with Jerry Springer show, all you have to do is watch a Trump rally.
We'll stay out of that. She was heading toward it with recreating yourself. Well, never.
Yeah, I wasn't heading for it.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Let's
yes.
thank Jennifer for her.